Thank you all so much for coming. Those of you that are here from Temple Israel, it's wonderful to have you participate in this. Those of you who are here as the distinguished panel, thank you so much for taking your time to present more information on this very important topic. As I mentioned in my sermon yesterday, this is a critical topic that is facing the United States Jewish community, and it is one that is only going to continue to increase in importance, and one that I hope will also increase in Jewish activism. We have spent a lot of time in this country with our heads down and advocating on other topics, but not always advocating for the core principles of this country that has allowed it to be a place where we have thrived like no other for the last 2,000 years. And if we wish to keep those core values of separation of church and state to allow for the flourishing of a Jewish community here, then we are going to need to be involved and especially be informed. So I'm very grateful to our panelists for helping to share exactly what is going on and what we can be aware of and what we can do. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for hosting us. We're really excited to have this conversation. So I'm going to just start by sharing a little bit about Jews for a Secular Democracy and what our initiative is all about before I turn it over to our panelists. So Jews for a Secular Democracy is an initiative of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. It is a pluralistic initiative that seeks to galvanize the Jewish community to advocate for separation of church and state. We're going to be talking a lot about Christian nationalism, which is a rising threat that we feel that the Jewish community is well positioned to speak to. But of course, Christian nationalism and the incursion of religion on government impacts all of us, people of all faiths and no faith. What we'll be talking about today is, well, actually, let me step back for a second. One of the reasons that we started this initiative in the first place. So Jews for Secular Democracy, we're really trying to fill a space. We recognize that there are excellent national Jewish organizations that do great work around social justice, but not necessarily specifically to church-state separation. And on the other hand, there are fantastic national secular organizations, Secular Coalition for America, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, many others that are doing great work on church-state separation, but not necessarily from the Jewish perspective specifically. And we feel that given our history, given our position as a religious minority in the United States, we have a unique voice that we can speak to in terms of why it matters so much to keep religion and government separate, how that guarantees religious freedom, not just for the Jewish community, but for all of us. And there are a number of issues that, church-state separation is not really just an issue in itself. It's a constitutional principle that hits on nearly every single policy area. And we're going to be talking about Rick Gold, who is our lead volunteer in Florida, is going to be talking about some of the things we've been seeing in the Florida legislature, and you'll see a really, really broad array of issues, all that come back to church-state separation. So when we think about church-state separation, we think about issues like reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights and other civil rights, but we're also talking about everything from education policy, healthcare policy, tax policy. The incursion of religion on government is happening in nearly every policy area. We had a great program not too long ago featuring the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, where we learned a lot about how there's a incursion of religion in government in our military. So there's really almost no policy space or cultural space where we're not seeing this play out. And so it's really important that we understand not just why separation of church and state is important, but also the urgency of which we need to attack this issue, because it really is permeating in every single aspect of our lives. And so Jews for a Secular Democracy, one of the reasons we're doing this and having conversations like this is because we want to make sure the Jewish community is educated about this issue, is having the opportunity to think about what our role is, how we can be impactful. And what we hope that you'll get out of this, in addition to new information, maybe a new perspective on these issues, is we hope that you'll be inspired to take action. And so Rick will talk about this as well, but we do have upcoming meetings that you can join as a volunteer. We will be having all kinds of actions that you can take part in, whether it's meeting with your legislators, writing op-eds, or just having conversations with your family and friends or on your social media. So we'll be talking about a lot of the different issues that are specific to Florida as well as nationally. And I hope that by the end of this, you'll want to join Jews for Secular Democracy, particularly in Florida, because we set out on this tour hoping to build relationships with leadership and members like yourselves who want to join us in making sure that Jews who support separation of church and state in Florida are heard as a cohesive, united voice. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel when we started on this, and we, did our research and asked around and found that there isn't really an established coalition that you can go to. Here's all the Jewish community leaders. Here's all the voices in Florida who will speak up when there's a violation of church-state separation with one voice from a Jewish perspective. And that's what we're hoping to build with your help. So with that, just as a general sense of what we're trying to accomplish, I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Shapiro.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah. And let me just share the screen, but let me bid you all a very meaningful Yom Yerushalayim, the 54th anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem. And note that 2 minutes ago on the notifications from Haaretz, Jerusalem itself for the first time was targeted by Hamas rockets. So I am, and I bid you welcome as well to the congregation that first brought me to Florida back in 1983 as I served as education director of Temple Israel. Nonetheless, I am most eager not to talk to you, but rather to hear from you. And I'm looking forward to an animated discussion in the Q&A, the question and answer session, because I would like to know why it is that the good people of Temple Israel continue to support with their financial dollars educational programs around the state that teach that Africa needs religion and that the gospel is not taught in Jerusalem. And you are teaching this. 10% of Africans can read and write, and mission schools are shut down by communists. That's part of a curriculum that you're paying to have taught in local religious Christian schools. You're paying through Florida's corporate tax scholarship scheme. Not just you, by the way, I'm paying for this educational curriculum. All Floridians are paying through their tax dollars in this educational curriculum in classes, again, around Orlando that use the ABECA book curriculum developed at Pensacola Christian College, who the wife of the chancellor's name is Rebecca, so it's called ABECA book. We are also paying for a curriculum that teaches that slave masters were nice guys, and that a few slaveholders were cruel, but everybody else treated their slaves well. That's a curriculum that's used in schools around Orlando that comes from Bob Jones University Press. The ultimate outcome, or the ultimate goal, is to teach that slavery, as was practiced in this country before the Civil War, was a wonderful and a good thing because it brought pagan Africans to these shores to be baptized in the name of Jesus. I'm paying for that. You are paying for that with your tax dollars. You need to be aware of that. You are also paying for a curriculum that teaches that the KKK was A-OK. It was a means of reform. It targeted bootleggers, wife beaters, and so on. It achieved a certain amount of respectability. That's being taught in schools not far from where you live that use the curriculum of Bob Jones University Press. There's the book in the lower right-hand corner. You and I are also paying to have taught in the religious schools of Orlando the gospel according to Matthew. We're in chapter 23. It makes it clear, and you are paying for this, I'm paying for this, that we are the ones who murdered the prophets, that we are a brood of vipers, and we'll kill and crucify prophets and sages and teachers. and we flog them in our synagogues and pursue them from town to town. You and I are paying to have this taught in schools through Florida's newly expanded, by the way, corporate tax fellow scholarship program. This is also taught that Pontius Pilate said, "I'm innocent of this man's blood. It's your responsibility," at the time of the crucifixion, and that the people, the Jews, answered, "His blood is on us and our children," that we are all guilty of deicide, of killing God, of the crucifixion of Jesus. And there are schools that teach the gospel according to John, and they teach that in verse 38, "I'm telling you what I've seen in your father's presence. You are doing what you heard. Abraham is our father. And if you were Abraham's children," Jesus says, "you would do what as Abraham did. But you belong to your father, the devil." That's our father. We're paying for that to be taught. "And you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning. And when he lies, he speaks a native language. He, like us, are the father of lies." And so we are paying for these curricular elements through a program that supports private education, a scholarship funding organization called Step Up for Students, and they receive close to $1 billion a year to give scholarships to private schools. 74% of them are religious schools, and out of our tax dollars, we are having things that are taught that are an anathema to us. I think we have a Jewish interest in this. The Jewish community has an interest in this, and we most certainly need to learn to speak up and speak out against such excesses. Thank you very much.
Okay, Jim Coffin here, and I would like to just speak a bit about Christian nationalism. And I believe that Christian nationalism is not only disadvantageous to other minority faiths, but it's disadvantageous to Christians as well. First of all, because it distorts the history of the United States. It distorts the understanding of our founders. And it also distorts the teachings, I believe, of Jesus. And so I'd like to share just a few comments that come from an organization called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And there are a large number of clergy who have signed on to this. And initially they wondered, should we just have everybody sign on to it who is concerned about Christian nationalism? And they said, no, let's just have Christians do it, because that might be unexpected that Christians would take offense at the idea of Christian nationalism. So anyway, I'd just like to share a few thoughts with you that come from their manifesto, as it were, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. As Christians, our faith teaches that everyone is created in God's image, and it commands us to love one another. As Americans, we value our system of government and the good that can be accomplished in our constitutional democracy. Today, we are concerned about a persistent threat to our religious communities and our democracy, specifically Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism seeks to merge Christian and American identities, distorting both the Christian faith and America's constitutional democracy. Christian nationalism demands Christianity be privileged by the state and implies that to be a good American, one must be Christian. It often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. We reject this damaging political ideology and invite our Christian brothers and sisters to join us in opposing this threat to our faith and to our nation. As Christians, we are bound to Christ not by citizenship, but by faith. We believe that people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. Patriotism does not require us to minimize our religious convictions, and one's religious affiliation or lack thereof should be irrelevant to one's standing in the civic community. Government should not prefer one religion over another, or religion over non-religion. Religious instruction is left best to the houses of worship, other religious institutions, and families. America's historic commitment to religious pluralism enables faith communities to live in civic harmony with one another without sacrificing our theological convictions. Conflating religious authority and political authority is idolatrous and often leads to oppression of minority and other marginalized. Stand up to and speak out against Christian nationalism, especially when it inspires acts of violence and intimidation, including vandalism, bomb threats, arson, hate crimes, and attacks on houses of worship against religious communities at home or abroad. Whether we worship at a church, mosque, synagogue, or temple, America has no second-class faiths. All are equal under the US Constitution. As Christians, we must speak with one voice, condemning Christian nationalism as a distortion of the gospel of Jesus and as a threat to American democracy. And so we believe that it is a substantial historical distortion to believe that we started out as a Christian nation and therefore we need to be returned to being a Christian nation. We started out as a nation that certainly had a significant population of Christians, but recognized the benefit of including pluralism and recognizing the right and the responsibility that falls on all of us to make sure that everyone is included. And unfortunately, that is being twisted, distorted, and we have movements afield today that are disadvantageous to everyone, believer, non-believer, whatever it might be. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Reverend Coffin and Rabbi Shapiro. I'm Rick Gold, an organizer for the Humanistic Judaism community in Gainesville, Florida. And in putting together my group, I've realized the power of Jewish teachings and ethics to promote social action. And I think that it's important that Temple Israel also recognize how empowering the Jewish tradition is in these areas. I believe that it's time for Florida Jews to live out Jewish values and religious teachings by coming together with other religious and secular groups to advocate for separation of church and state at the state level. Church-state separation is under threat by the Florida legislature, as shown by the bills proposed and passed in the recent March and April legislative session. Well, some of the attacks come from politically conservative legislators inspired by President Trump. Others come from those committed to Christian nationalism. While some Jewish representatives and senators oppose separation of church and state, they represent a small minority of the Jewish community in Florida. Inspired by a history of persecution of Jews by governments throughout the world, most Florida Jews support the principles of separation of church and state contained in the US Constitution and affirmed by our courts. However, we've not yet created a statewide advocacy organization to voice these concerns. The national organization, Jews for a Secular Democracy, provides a platform for the majority of Florida Jews who are committed to separation of church and state and oppose Christian nationalism. This platform will help us to organize ourselves statewide in a nonpartisan manner on a targeted set of issues. These issues range from protecting the right to vote, fighting prayer in public schools, protecting the requirements to teach evolution and sex education in schools, opposing government funding of religious institutions, assuring that religious liberty does not include the right to discriminate, expanding reproductive rights, and protecting LGBTQ rights. In advocating for separation of church and state and opposing efforts by Christian nationalists to impose their agenda in Florida, our Jews for a Secular Democracy network can help us use our Jewish experience, ideals, religious teachings, and history to ally with like-minded religious and secular groups. Together, we can stop the most egregious assaults by Christian nationalists and political conservatives on church-state separation. Over time, we can reverse the damage done and build a strong legislative commitment to separation of church and state. But it's important to recognize that the Florida House is controlled by legislatures who are chipping away at separation of church and state and promoting Christian nationalism. The Senate is also politically conservative, but sometimes puts a brake on abusive legislation passed by the House. Until elections change the makeup of the legislature, advocates for church-state separation must fight negative legislation and take advantage of the few opportunities for progress on this issue. Some of the very negative and laws that were passed in the most recent legislative session include post-secondary education. This law was designed to increase the opportunity for college and university students to hear politically conservative and Christian nationalist perspective. It allows students and others to intimidate professors, student governments, and university administrators who do not give these perspectives equal time. Then there's the Parents' Bill of Rights. This law states that only parents can make religious upbringing or health decisions for their children. It gives parents the right to remove their children from sex education classes and to object to curricula based on morality, sex, or religion. Schools are required under this law to get written approval from parents to provide health services, which could prematurely out children as gay or transgender before they've chosen to come out to their parents. Then there's the Safety of Religious Institutions law, which allows concealed carry of weapons in religious buildings that also house schools, an exception to the prohibition of concealed carry in all schools. There's the Moment of Silence in Public Schools law, which amends a law permitting study of the Bible and religion by requiring also a moment of silence. It mandates that public school teachers lead students in daily moments of reflection, a strategy used by school prayer activists to promote unconstitutional teacher-led prayer. It also requires teachers to encourage parents to discuss with their children how to use the moment of silence, which gives teachers the opportunity to promote prayer. There was the recent approval of the transgender sports ban law. This law prohibits people born biologically men from competing on women's athletics teams. Schools must verify the child's biological sex by reviewing the original birth certificate. A law called School Choice streamlined scholarship programs and created educational savings accounts, which can be used for either public or private religious schools. It expanded the use of public funding for religious schools, some of which spread the teachings highlighted by Rabbi Shapiro or discriminate against LGBTQ students. Finally, there's the regulations of social media apps for censoring political or religious speech or deplatforming political candidates. This law prohibits social media platforms from unfairly censoring, shadow banning, deplatforming, or applying post-prioritization algorithms to political candidates, journalists, users, or residents. It applies to everyone but the Disney company. From reading the Temple Israel website and listening to Rabbi Neely, I understand that Temple Israel members, like many Jews, are committed to acting on Jewish values by promoting social justice. One important opportunity to promote social justice is to advocate for separation of religion and state. With support from Jews for a Secular Democracy, Jewish advocates for separation of church and state in Florida are beginning to organize for the 2022 legislative session. In the next year, we can develop our network, educate the community through letters to the editor and public meetings, contacting and meeting with key legislators. We could support court challenges against the laws passed in the 21 session and develop model legislation and think through tactics for fighting legislation challenging church-state separation. In addition, we ask you to add your name to the Jews for a Secular Democracy petition, which challenges the use of the term Judeo-Christian values by Christian nationalists who want legislators to believe their policies reflect Jewish values. Finally, please add your name and email to the Google document in the chat so we can share additional information with you and alert you to opportunities for urgent action. Thanks very much.
Now is a great time to ask any questions. And for those of you who had some trouble getting in, please note that we do have a recording of this and we'll send that out as well if you missed any of the earlier presentation. But please do add your questions to the chat now. You can ask a question of any of the panelists on any of the things that we talked about. And in the meantime, I'm going to also add in here, we have the petition. If you want to learn more about the issue of Judeo-Christian and the use of that phrase, we also have resources where you can read more about that on our website here. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, Rabbi Neely, did you have anything you wanted to share, any thoughts? Or it may be an opening question.
Well, I'll leave room for the questions from the other participants. I've got a few in the back, but we'll wait and let other people talk first. But really, thank you for the great presentation. I just want to make sure that everybody understands the terminology behind Christian nationalism, which may have been unfamiliar to some of the people that are attending. I know that's one of the common issues that we face when we are nose down in an issue, that we assume that others are as familiar with the term. So not so much a question, but maybe just an invitation while people are putting other questions in, just to explain a little bit more about the roots behind Christian nationalism and what the ultimate goal is, and some of the steps that we have already seen from groups and people that are working in that direction.
Absolutely, that's great. A great question. So, Reverend Coffin, do you want to take that first? And I have a few thoughts, but I feel like that should be your question to take first.
Well, at the time that the Constitution was written, there was no mention of God whatsoever in the Constitution. And the mention of religion was just that the state wasn't to establish religion, and it wasn't to prevent the free exercise of it. So the state shouldn't be in the business of making decisions about religion, good, bad, or indifferent. And there were people at the time who thought that that was not a great idea. They thought that God should have been in it, and they've been fighting ever since. And it has waxed and waned in terms of how effective it has been. However, there are some people, there's a so-called historian named David Barton, who has tried to go through and check out statements that were made by the founders of the nation and so on, to try to find proof that we really were a Christian nation. And therefore we should be returning to that. And all of the things that have actually probably brought us greater tranquility, such as removal of Bible readings and removal of prayer from public schools, are viewed as anathema, and they're the cause of every problem that we have. And if we could just get back to the kind of relationship that we used to have with Christianity, that would be it. The reality is that we didn't start the nation with a clean slate. We started it with carryovers from the old world. And so there were religious preferences in the various colonies, et cetera. However, things began to sort of come together more and more. And by the time of the Constitution, it was recognized that this was disadvantageous to have these state preferred religions and state subsidized religions. And so when the Constitution was formed, it did away with that. It took about 80 years after the Constitution was formed to kind of clean up what was going on. And then that really stirred people up and they said, whoa, you know, we're losing everything here. And so there's been a regression. And there's a term, dominionism, and Christian nationalism, and there are some other expressions as well. But the idea is a group of people think that we need to make the United States a Christian nation, and basically we would tolerate everybody else. You know, you would be here, but you would always be second class. And there are many, many Christians. In fact, I would argue that the majority of Christians, if they had it explained to them, would say, we don't want this at all. But a minority is very active, working very hard, and it sounds good the way they present it to their own group of zealots, and people jump on the bandwagon.
And just to clarify, the second class nature that you're talking about would not only be that they would be permitted to discriminate against people of other faiths and to show preference to people of whatever the dominant faith would be at the end of this, but that this would also allow for them to guide public policy such that it conformed to their version of Christianity, to the exclusion or perhaps creating even legal barriers, full exercise of other faiths. So it's not just a question of people would not be given full status. There are many countries in Europe, such as England and elsewhere, that have a state religion, which still protect the rights of minorities. But the Christian nationalists, the dominionists, are not interested only in having the pomp and circumstance of their religion to go along with the state, but are looking to implement real policies that will not only show preference for their faith, but will be to the detriment of other faiths and to the limitation of the free exercise of our faith.
And I might just add to that, that initially you won't see it in its worst forms, which is always the case. You know, when discrimination and bigotry begin to reign, you don't see it initially in its worst forms, but that's where it's headed.
If I could add to that, so I think one simple way to think about Christian nationalism is, and this is really building on what Reverend Coffin already said, but it's really to make it so that the idea of what it is to be an American is to be a Christian, and to be Christian as an American, right? It's that merging of identity and really defining, you know, and if you define being American as being Christian, right, that others everybody else. And in terms of your question of how does it manifest? So I want to use a few examples that I think are really, really good, both past and present of what it looks like when Christian nationalism is codified into policy. So there's sort of the symbolic thing. So a lot of people don't know that in God we trust was not always our national motto, and that under God was not always in the pledge. Those were changes made in the 1950s during the Red Scare, the hysteria against, you know, so-called godless communists, but it was very intentional. And we can see why they use these kinds of symbols, which are usually kind of dismissed as harmless, right? One, it reinforces their myth that, like Reverend was saying, that we've always been a Christian nation. If they can point to the pledge and point to the national motto and bank on people not knowing that it wasn't always like that, they can say, see, you know, we say it every morning when we say the Pledge of Allegiance. And one thing I want to call your attention to, and I'm going to put this link in the chat, Jews for Secular Democracy is proud to be part of the Blitzwatch Coalition, which is a response to Project Blitz. Project Blitz, thanks to, we only know about it because of really smart reporting. A reporter found the full playbook of Christian nationalist organizations and what their game plan was for Project Blitz, which is to basically blitz the legislatures, state legislatures, with legislation that furthers their agenda in stages. And the first stage was to pass, and one of these bills actually is now law in Florida, that mandates "In God We Trust" to be prominently displayed in public schools. There's a reason they start with that as stage one, because it's something that is seen as harmless, by both sides of the aisle, not just conservatives, and then leads to, reinforces that Christian nation myth. And then they go to the next stage. What is the last stage of that plan? They want the broadest possible religious exemptions for laws that are actually neutral and apply to everybody else. So whether they're non-discrimination laws or they're public health and safety laws, they want to have religious carve-outs for generally applicable laws. And they want to be able to not only get out of regulations and laws that apply to everybody else just on the basis of religion, they want to be able to do that while receiving taxpayer money. So one trend that we're seeing, and this is just one example, there's many different forms that it takes. The voucher schemes are a great example of this that Rabbi was talking about, but we're also seeing a lot of bills introduced that say that if you are a adoption care center or a foster care agency that is faith-based, that's contracting with the government, and the government has, it basically, the legislation they're trying to pass would make it so that the government could not say, we will only contract with agencies that don't discriminate on the basis of religion. Now, that is basically making access to taxpayer dollars and government contracts a right instead of a privilege. So a Christian foster care agency can be taking taxpayer money to provide a social service that's really meant to be for all tax-paying citizens, and then not adopt two Jewish couples, not adopt two interfaith couples, not adopt to same-sex couples, all while contracting with the government and receiving taxpayer dollars. That's what they ultimately want. They want access to government funding, access to taxpayer dollars, and to be able to discriminate or be exempt from any sort of accountability for how those dollars are used in the name of religious liberty. So that's kind of the end game here. And we've seen them have a lot of success with judicial advocacy. This has been going on for decades. And just now we're starting to see the effects. They know that demographically they're not in the majority, and that they're losing the fight on the culture wars. So one of the big parts of the Christian nationalist strategy has been to get judges and attorneys general into place that have a view of the First Amendment that is not friendly to separation of church and state. And that's why the Supreme Court was so important for Christian nationalists in past elections. And we're seeing the fruits of that labor now. There's a case that is coming out any day now called Fulton v. City of Philadelphia, which touches on the issue we talked about earlier with the government contracting with organizations. The City of Philadelphia found that one of their contractors was discriminating against LGBT couples, and they actually provided an accommodation, but it didn't go far enough for the agencies, and they sued all the way up until the Supreme Court. And depending on how that decision comes down, it is very possible that the Supreme Court that we have, which was intentionally stacked with people who do not have a friendly view of separation of church and state, who see the free exercise clause as totally superseding the establishment clause, which is the basis of separation of church and state. What may happen is they may basically tie the hands of any government, city, state, whatever, from being able to apply any sort of strings to any funding. So they won't be able to say, yes, we'll contract with you, but you can't discriminate. So that's probably some of the most dangerous. And then there's a lot of things that are less visible. So another issue that's really interesting to look at is hospital mergers. This is the kind of thing where you don't really know about it until you're in an emergency situation. And this, I think, is something that the Jewish community really has a stake in talking about, and we have a unique perspective. It intersects with reproductive rights often. So if you have mergers with, for example, Catholic affiliated hospital and a secular hospital, that whatever providers are now under that umbrella are subject to ethical and religious directives, including on contraception and reproductive rights. So there have been a number of really horrific cases of women in situations where they are have an unviable fetus and need an induced abortion to protect their life. And they have gone to their hospital and they're turned away and sent home and nearly died because the hospital, rather than acting on best practices, is acting on a specific Christian view on abortion and conception. And again, these are cases where, you know, these are women who wanted their children, but they're in this awful, awful scenario. And people don't know. They don't know that they're in a faith-based, in a hospital that's not going to provide them that care. And unfortunately, one of the few things that we can do in this situation now is to at least require them to provide transparency. So for example, there's a bill in New York that would require all providers that are operating under these ethical and religious directives to at least make it known. Right. But I think this is, I use this example because this is the imposition of a very specific set of beliefs about abortion on anyone who enters those hospitals and those providers. The Jewish community largely has a very different view on how to weigh the life of the mother in those situations. And the last thing I'll give as an example from my earlier point about foster care agencies, we have seen this actually happen. We have seen under the Trump administration, there was a foster care agency in South Carolina called Miracle Hill, which denied a Jewish woman her application to volunteer at the agency just on the basis that she was not an evangelical Christian. That agency was receiving state funding and got a special waiver from the Trump administration to continue to discriminate while using state funding. So Christian nationalism is both all the obvious things, right? The symbolic stuff, but it's also all the insidious aspects of our lives, both in our healthcare, in our schools, and a big part of that advocacy, what we see is state legislatures, a lot happening at the local level, and of course, stacking the courts.
I would be curious to know, between the Jewish experience and that of other faith minorities in particular, what difference there is in terms of the passion on this particular topic. I think as Jews, because we have spent most of the last 2,000 years for the vast majority of our people around the world as guests, and certainly made to feel like guests in other countries. And of course, all the countries until very recently in modernity were of some faith orientation, that we have gotten used to the idea that a country has a particular faith identity. And of course, that doesn't match our identity, that's just the way that things are, you know. When you're in Rome, yes, they're going to be Catholic. When you're in England, they're going to be Anglican, and so on and so forth. Yemen, they're Muslim. And that's, you know, as Jews, we just put up with whatever the local person is. We follow their laws to the best as possible. If they make it completely untenable, then we flee the country. You know, I'm looking at Spain. But I think it'd be interesting to know whether or not that's carrying over into the American situation. Have Jews reached a point in this country where we do actually feel that we are partial owners rather than mere guests in the country, that we actually have rights protected by the Constitution, not by the good graces of the real inhabitants of the state, and whether or not other religious minorities that don't have the same history of being pushed to the periphery of religious-oriented states, whether they are more vocal in their opposition to some of these issues than the Jewish community is.
I would certainly respond that there are other minorities who have some similarity. I often caution not to regard Judaism as a religion, since it has a cultural and nationalistic element as well, that Mormons, for example, or Seventh-day Adventists do not. But Mormons, who are often by Christian dominionists not counted as Christians, are speaking out on this issue. And my organization, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, was actually founded by Seventh-day Adventists who were responding to the onerous burden of blue laws, often in the Northeast United States, but elsewhere, that required them to close their businesses on Sundays, as Jews were required to close on Sundays. Some of you know places in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and certainly Bergen County, New Jersey, to this very day, requires you close your business on Sundays. So if you want to close on Shabbat, If you want to close on Saturday, you have to close 2 days a week. And so they are standing up for, recognition. We as Jews, by the way, are often the descendants of grandparents or great-grandparents who came to this country and said, we want to put behind us all of that we had in Europe, and we would like to go forward not as Jews, but as Americans. And so they saw an unwritten covenant, of course. The sociologist Marshall Sklar spoke about this innumerable times. If we will eat American foods, eat in their restaurants, take off our funny hats and clothing, and celebrate holidays like they celebrate holidays, America will make us rich and safe. And so America has, in fact, compared to our grandparents and great-grandparents, made us rich and safe. But it's time to stand up. If I can be if I can teach in front of my greater colleague, Talmud says, Shtika kedamya hodaya, that silence is assent. And that we, Seventh-day Adventists, I think, are a little more vocal than we are, and Mormons have been a little more vocal than we are. We have not been vocal. We have seemed to be silent. And so we have, in that way, assented, agreed, accepted the status quo. We no longer need to do so. And we as synagogues, congregations, as Jewish federations and other communal organizations need to speak out. I have a slide, I'll save it, but I'll finish with the strictures of the Internal Revenue Service Code, Section 501c3, that require us to maintain our tax-exempt status by refraining from partisan political activities. But that doesn't mean we need to refrain from discussing how our government is run, which is not a partisan political, it's not pro one candidate or against another candidate. The government is making decisions on our behalf that is not in our best interest, and we need to stand up, we need to speak up. Otherwise, our silence is recognized as agreement. I don't know if that entirely answered your question, Rabbi Neely, but I wanted to share that as well. And if others want to chime in, they're more than welcome, of course.
Yeah, I'd like to add that, we in the US as Jews are privileged to live under a constitution that guarantees the rights associated with freedom of religion and separation of church and state. But these always require challenges to governmental practices to ensure that they actually are our rights. We are in a much better situation than Jews living in other countries, including France and Quebec, which have their own version of secularism, laïcité, which basically assures that Jews are citizens, but as a religious group, they are not comfortable or allowed to show their religion in public, to wear signs of their religion. We're in even better situation than Jews living in many countries that have a state religion. I'm particularly familiar with the Jews living in Morocco, where the Moroccan king protects the Jewish population, but Muslims living in Morocco recognize Jews as fellow citizens, but really discourage their participation in public office, as well as showing that they're Jews in public. So it's a sign that we are in the U.S. very privileged as Jews to live under a country that has the ideal of separation of church and state, but we have to fight for it, as Rabbi Shapiro said. Thanks.
I'd like to add really quickly too that, you know, part of Christian nationalism is really the imposition of Christian supremacy as well as white supremacy. I really encourage you to look at the statement of principles by Christians Against Christian Nationalism, because there's a recognition there that Christian nationalism and white supremacy overlap quite a bit. They're in many ways one and the same. And it's not just a question of whether or not we can live with sort of having a dominant cultural Christianity be dominant culturally and religiously. There is a danger to Christian nationalism because it is absolutely related to the rise in hate crimes toward not just anti-Semitic hate crimes, but, you know, other religious minorities have been impacted by this as well. So it not only allowing Christian nationalism to be unchallenged really is dangerous for religious minorities, because it doesn't just say, well, this is just the majority of us, and so we're gonna, you know, have these be the mainstream holidays. It's so much more than that, because if you're saying that to be an American is to be Christian, it means that everyone else who is not, and not your type of Christian, right, the right Christian, is less American, perhaps not even welcome to be in this country or to immigrate to this country. Here's a question from Barbara following up on what you were saying, Rick. So maybe you want to take this question. She said, could not showing religious affiliation publicly be also to protect that citizenry from bias and harm?
Of course, Jews have to do whatever is necessary to survive and keep to their traditions and their community wherever they are, and to adapt to the environment, as Rabbi Neely said. But why should they have to adapt rather than to work to change that environment? It's important not only to help to change the laws and the implementation of the laws, but also the social environment that might make them ashamed to show their religion or their affiliation with Judaism publicly. And so all of that is important in terms of fighting for separation of church and state.
If I could also add, as somebody who does wear a kippah pretty much all the time, everywhere, very much in the same way that we would not want to fight against sexual abuse by putting new limitations on what people could and couldn't wear, how much skin they can and can't show, but instead by targeting those who actually commit those acts of violence. So too, we don't protect religious minorities from discrimination or abuse by forcing them to go into hiding, but instead by targeting those that actually commit the acts of violence. And yes, in Quebec and in France, I have been aghast that the secular governments there have passed laws that have severely curtailed the rights of people to display their Jewish and other religious identities in public. And I do not think that is going to diminish any problems that they might be experiencing in those places, but instead it will, as Mr. Gold just said, diminish the ability of the freedom of the individual to express their own identity, their own faith.
Yeah, oh, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, I mean, I sort of have a personal rule of thumb that if I feel that I need to take off my kippah when I go into a place because of fear of discrimination or of insult and bias, then I'm not going there. If I can't be free to be myself and to proudly show who I am in that place, then that place doesn't get my business. That place is not going to get my tourism. That place needs to adjust before I'm going to frequent it. And certainly here in the US, if such a thing were being proposed, I would be adamantly opposed, because I need to be able to know that I can walk down the streets of my neighborhood or anywhere else in where I live, being able to feel unharassed because of my Jewish identity. And certainly not harassed by the state.
And if I may add that the idea of suppressing our Jewish identity in public is an anathema to that for which we stand, and remind everyone that anti-Semitism is only the second most dangerous threat to the American Jewish community. That the forces of assimilation are much, much greater. And I think the rabbis, and we've been joined by yet another one, Rabbi David Kay, I think they would agree that intermarriage and ultimate assimilation of Jews is the cause to a much greater loss from our community than anti-Semitism, that we need to reinforce our identity. Let me, if I may, also turn back to something Sarah said, associating Christian dominionism, Christian supremacy with white supremacy, and remind everyone, as we were well reminded in the wake of the activity in Charlottesville, Virginia, after the removal of a Robert E. Lee statue, and seeing white supremacists chant, "Jews will not replace us," that in the mind of white supremacists, Jews are not whites, that we are not white. And we won't get, I'll leave it to Rabbi Neely to teach and explain the supersessionism in Christianity and what that all means. But in the end, white supremacy and Christian nationalism are hand in hand, and something that we need to be ever mindful of.
I'd like to just quickly talk about because we're comparing, a version of secularism in other countries to the United States. So I think I just want to make a fine point on this. From our perspective, when we talk about separation of church and state, it means that the government doesn't promote any religion over others or religion over non-religion. It also means not promoting non-religion over religion, right? It goes in all directions. And that's what's so problematic about this version of secularism, is that suppressing expression of religion is not true religious freedom. Our Constitution has the free exercise clause in the same section as the establishment clause, because they're interdependent freedoms that do have to be balanced. The question and the tension point is often when those things come into conflict, where free expression of religion is in conflict with the establishment clause. And generally, I think a good rule of thumb is drawing the line at harm. When free expression of religion, whether it's wearing the kippah or a hijab, that does not impact someone else's rights. That is free expression of religion. But there are expressions of religion that can cause harm to other people. We do have to draw the line at certain things. It's not, no rights, including, free speech, is not limitless. Like, there are certain limited circumstances where we have to draw the line at harm. And a great example of where we would like to draw the line is things like government funding of religion. Any expression of religion that imposes your religion on other people in a way that actually causes them demonstrable harm and deprives them of their ability to exercise their religion. That's where we have a problem. That's where a lot of our issues right now of non-discrimination and making sure that people can actually be served and as equals in businesses, have access to healthcare. When you are going to the pharmacy to have your prescription filled, allowing the pharmacist to impose their religious beliefs, regardless of what yours are, and deciding, no, I'm not going to fill your prescription, that's a problem, because it's your religious beliefs coming against someone else's who's in a profession that's really just supposed to be evidence-based. And it's the same if you're going to this whole, I don't remember her name now, but you might remember there was a case where a clerk who gave out marriage licenses didn't want to have to provide those licenses to same-sex couples, even though that was now legal. Now, she's a government official, right? And so her religious, not only is she's a representative of the government, but she, her religious freedom is not quite the same as just a civilian. But that's an example of her denying a license to someone who legally should have it is discrimination, and that's her imposing her religious beliefs. And one other example I'll give is employees and employers. This was the huge problem with Hobby Lobby, which if you're not familiar with the case, you might remember that the Affordable Care Act was passed. It included a mandate that employers provide insurance options that have free contraception. Hobby Lobby, which is a craft store that employs a lot of people in the United States, sued because the owners believe, contrary to actual evidence and science, that certain types of contraceptions are abortifacients, as they call them. And they won that case 5-4. And what that set the precedent for, among many other things, I'm kind of trying to simplify a complicated case, but one thing that was so dangerous about it for separation of church and state is that it allows your employer to impose their religious beliefs on you, the employee, but you, the employee, have your own religious beliefs. So that's where the tension point is. But I think when it comes to things like wearing a kippah, that doesn't cause any harm to anybody, right? That doesn't impose on anybody, and offense at someone being different than you is certainly not harm. If I said anything wrong or inaccurate about those cases, I'm sure Rabbi Shapiro will correct me.
I would just add one comment going back to the Christian nationalism. It is a form of government that has been tried on this soil, okay, and it failed. It was a miserable failure. And so the Christian nationalists are right in one respect. The pilgrims who came here were Christian nationalists. And so by the time we'd moved to the Constitution, it had been rejected. It was recognized that what the pilgrims were trying to set up was not what we wanted to have as a nation. And the founders, when we talk about the founders and we're thinking about the Constitution, it was a totally different group. Robert Ingersoll says that the pilgrims left England to escape persecution and went to Holland. They left Holland and came to America to escape religious liberty, because in Holland they had religious liberty and they saw that their kids associated with others who had different ideas, and they said, no, we want to have a situation where we have total control. And so they couldn't take religious liberty. They came here to this country to get away from it. And but it was out of that whole milieu then that Roger Williams moved forward with the idea of separation of church and state, and the Enlightenment came along, and there were just a tremendous amount of forces that came together. But one other thing to keep in mind is one of the things that stopped Christian nationalists at the time of the Constitution was nobody could agree on whose church was going to be the church. And so that was one of the things that actually gave them an incentive to kind of back off. Some people who would have liked to have continued the European model a bit more, they backed off because they couldn't come to any conclusion about whether it was going to be Catholic or Anglican or Presbyterian or whatever.
As I mentioned in my sermon yesterday, as a matter of fact. And one of the things I think that's very interesting is, as Rabbi Shapiro mentioned about the threat of assimilation. Assimilation has been driven not just by Jews wanting to give up their faith, but for much of the 20th century, you were incentivized to give up your faith, primarily because of not only social pressures, but also because of legal or institutional pressures. As he mentioned, the Sunday closing laws forced many Jews to have to make the decision of whether or not to violate Shabbat and open up their stores and go to work at factories on Saturday, or to not be able to make their way in this country. And that was especially acute in the early part of the 20th century when most of the Jews were arriving from Europe. And many of these types of laws, many of these restrictions on Jewish participation in university and in public office and other things encouraged Jews to give up their Judaism much more successfully than all of the door knocking and pamphleteering that went on in the soft form of missionizing. And that is something that we need to be aware of, that for the long-term health and longevity of the Jewish people, there needs to be a free marketplace of ideas. There needs to be a scale where people can choose what they wish to believe without there being a thumb on one of the sides influencing what it would be a preference that is completely external to the merits of the arguments for the faith. I personally believe that Judaism's track record of the last 3,000 years shows that we can compete with our wisdom and ideas in even the most unfair circumstances. It'd be nice to see how we could compete if things were truly opened up and absolutely free. I believe that we will see that not only for Jews, but for many, that the wisdom that we have to teach is something that would be well received, especially if we can remove this stigma of imposed faith upon others.
Thank you. And I want to echo the words of Reverend Jim Coffin about the role of religion, but we need not go back to colonial times as well. I commend to you a book called The Last Call, and it will help you understand the role of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in creating prohibition as well. And that's one of many examples of what happens when we sit silently, say nothing, and allow, in this case, Christian interests to run our government.
And if I could just make an additional comment on that, it's interesting how organizations can be sort of fighting on different fronts and basing their fight on different principles or lack thereof, because the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which was fighting for separation of church and state, was a very active group in prohibition, in trying to bring it about. And so this kind of dichotomy that goes on, this internal dissonance is often there. And then we see that with some Jews in the way that they're reacting in legislatures. You know, they're moving away, moving forward in a way that is actually contrary to their values, actually.
Any other questions for the audience? All right, well, thank you so much to our hosts at Temple Israel. Thank you, Rabbi Neely. I want to remind everyone that you can get involved. We want to help empower Jewish members of the community in Florida to be more vocal on these issues. There are lots of ways to get involved. You can just start by having a conversation with your friends and family, sharing some of the information that we've shared with you on social media, in in-person conversations. But there's a lot more that you can do where, as Rick was saying, we are trying to network of people so that we can be prepared for the 2022 legislative session. And we could really use your help. And we do have a tentative date for our next meeting. I had it pulled up, but don't see it in front of me right now. But I do see a few of you already signed up to volunteer on the sheet. So I'm gonna, if you haven't yet signed up, you can sign up there. Please also, thank you for putting that back in the chat. And please also consider signing our petition, which challenges the use of Judeo-Christian to justify a Christian nationalist agenda with a sort of veneer of inclusivity that really isn't inclusive at all. And again, you can learn more about that issue on this link about that specific issue. So we hope that this was interesting to you, that you learned something new, and most importantly, that you're inspired to join us as we continue to educate the Jewish community and advocate for separation of church and state in Florida. So thanks again for hosting us, and we will be sending the link out as a recording so you can watch it again, or if you came in late, you'll be able to see the beginning of the presentation. Thank you again for hosting us.
Thank you so much for putting this presentation together, and thank you to all of the panelists.